Being young at Hammerwood. In this chapter, we describe what it was like for us living in Hammerwood. We loved being outdoors, so let's start there. The Bower House had 3 main gardens separated by wavy walls which, in parallel, curved their brackets of warm red brick down the hill. These walls were a single brick in width. Had they been built straight, they would simply have fallen over. In each wall was a curved archway, so that, standing at the garden door, one looked straight down the grass path and through the arches. Our beloved cousin, Margaret Ridge, always said that nobody ever created herbaceous borders like Sandy. On each side of that daisy-studded path were Sweet William, Love in a Mist, Bachelor's Buttons, and Mignonette. Then came the phlox, the Canterbury bells, and columbines. Behind them were sheaves of purple and gold Michaelmas daisies, 5 foot tall, and behind them again were the Espaliad's pear trees on either side, trees so old that they were constantly being threatened with the axe, for the pears were so woody that even ever-hungry Blagden children found them useless to eat. Margaret. One evening in late summer, when I was supposed to have gone to bed, probably about 8 years old, I was alone and looking out of the top playgroom window onto the flowered path and its banks of Michaelmas daisy. The backdrop of wavy walls, orchard, and then woodland stretched far away into the evening sky. I was overcome by the beauty of that sight, and quite definitely discovered for the first time that this is beautiful, and I must remember it and keep it all my life, rather like suddenly being conscious of how one has fallen in love. It was not just a garden, it was the whole setting. This is something which I have kept all my life, and which I shall never forget. Growing up at Hammerwood was a seamless passing of the years. The long stretches of white brick pathways in the upper garden were the roads for our hoops and trikes, and, later on, our fairy bicycles, as we rode around the tennis court, past the strawberry beds, between the greenhouses, past the blackcurrants and raspberries, down the hill steeply to the wall, and across to the back gate. One rowdy afternoon, our cousin Peter Parry went down that hill on a bike with no brakes. We all knew what would happen, and it did. Straight into the wall and a bloody nose for his pains. A few square concrete tanks for water tempted us to walk around their walls, but such familiarity, when we were too small, inevitably led to falling in and having to be rescued. As we grew older, we could sit in them, trying to cool off on very hot days. They were too cramped for anything else, and the water was not always pleasant because green slime tended to accumulate in them. But the one in the middle garden had a lively population of newts which could command our attention for hours. Apart from the sandpit, which was a joy for the constructions of infant engineers, the appurtenances of the garden included shelters in odd corners, in the angles of walls, although only the shelter near the potting shed, which was sunny and clean, was really used. That was where the currant baby could be wheeled in a pram to sleep in the healthy outdoors. That was where Margaret could sit for hours, struggling to learn how to knit, or how to find tunes on a penny whistle. And next to it was a wall, where one could play endless games with a ball. The main feature of the upper garden was the lawn, at the edge of which, looking out towards the wood, was a summer house that became Mummy's shelter later on. A great copper beech dominated the front trees of the wood, contrasting with the gentler greens. In spring the rhododendron undergrowth was a mass of pink. In winter the boughs were bare, reaching high to the sky. In the morning Venus would shine over the wood in the clear blue dawn sky. The ever-changing view was one which we had from the top playroom window. The lawn was in 2 levels, the lower lawn sloping up in a step of about 18 inches to the upper lawn. We used to roll up and down that slope. A large bed of blousy, indeed vulgarly large peonies, edged the far side of the lower lawn, on the one side of which stood our favourite swing. Other swings paled into insignificance beside this. It was really high, perhaps 10 or 12 foot. Its simple seat and very long ropes encouraged us to stand up and to reach great heights, 180 degrees, or even upside down. And then one could leap off onto the earth sloping away below. This was called showing off, or swank, but we think bravado would have been a kinder description, because the word earth was a euphemism for either hard, crumbly soil, or black mud, or a bed of vegetables. A few Brussels sprouts were no problem, but a deep-seated prejudice against artichokes after landing in their inhospitable thicket is probably embedded in our psyches for life. Except that for Henry, the artichoke thicket, towering over his head, was an exciting jungle asking to be explored. On the upper lawn was a long seesaw on which we used to play blue sky. That is to say, one end would try to bounce the opposition off the other end with vigorous bumping. Success was in sight when one could see the sky between the seesaw and the opposition's bottom. For the very small, there was a rocking wooden boat with an immortal motto on a little metal plate: "Strength in the toy is joy to the boy." During the last year or two at the Bower House, we had parallel bars, which were simply wonderful for tricks and balancing and countless other games. What joy! We had many good parties and games on that lawn. The only trouble was that Daddy insisted on mowing the grass just when all the daisies were out and we were making daisy chains. He hated daisies. We loved them, and their dear little pink-tipped petals. We worked a bit sometimes in the top garden. We used to help pick the soft fruit. Whether we were any good at this, who can say? But we tried to help because we were conscious of the pressure of rapidly ripening berries of all kinds, and the urgency of getting them sorted and packed and ready to go on the lorry to London to be sold. The trouble was that the season was short with sudden gluts. Strawberries, raspberries, black currants, red currants, gooseberries, their hairs were horrible on the hands, were the main crops. We had so many bushes of them. The top garden, too, was where we had cabbages, sprouts, peas, broad beans, most of the usual greens. Margaret loved watching Nan dig. In went the spade, and out it came with its clean-cut sod, and always a couple of squirmy worms trying to get out. Break up the sod, take out the odd weed, and dig again, fork and rake. The beds were beautiful. A few peach trees grew flat against the walls, carefully trained and producing a few magical velvet peaches every year. The smell of those peaches was more pervasive, more scented, more flavoured by the summer-time in England than any you would get in Africa. The greengage tree was at the bottom of the middle garden, and usually had a good crop. But gooseberries were the main theme of the middle garden. We had the ordinary green ones, but the best were the smaller red ones, like wine. Margaret. It was here, in the middle garden, that John and I were each given a patch of earth so that we could learn to grow things. Mine was a mess, and everything was straggly. John, even though he was so young, only 7 or 8 years old, had straight rows of perfect young plants. His clarkia grew about 2 foot high, bursting with heavy blooms like a hedge. From the very beginning he was a careful gardener with green fingers, and he has developed this gift excellently since then, with his leeks, his tomatoes, his broad beans and lettuces. One day, to everyone's surprise therefore, he pulled up all the marigolds and laid them neatly head to tail on the garden path, which led from the archway to the middle garden. I found him just as he was starting on the Love in a Mist, and I told on him. I had to. Daddy came and administered a suitable punishment. I could hear the cries from the lobby. We never knew what had got into John that day. Of all people, he was the best gardener. The bottom garden was dull. It either had fodder growing or crops of things which had no interest for us. We didn't go there much. And the paddock below that was where we had a couple of cows for some years, and once a Shetland pony called Peter. Otherwise it lay fallow. Our next best place was the orchard. To reach this, one went down the white path to the wall at the bottom, where a green wooden door led into the orchard. A muddy stream ambled gently through muddy grass. Of the apple trees, large old bramleys trailed low branches around them. Neat little russets held their heads up high, and a medlar looked mysterious. And for plums there were 2 damson trees which fruited very well indeed. Daddy worked hard on the orchard. There was always the pruning in winter, and the apple picking was hard work too. That he fell off the ladder several times and broke various ribs was regarded as a normal occupational hazard. Once Elizabeth was reading under the tree he was picking in, and down he came right next to her. She was so used to this, she just looked up and said, "Daddy, don't do that." In the orchard, a bit higher up, there was a little enclosure which was reputed to be an animal or pet graveyard, but we were never sure of this. At one time there was yet another swing there. It was quite delightful to sit up on the hill, swinging gently and looking out over the house and gardens. That part of the orchard was where rabbits lived. You could see their holes, and there were cowslips there. Impressively large tussocks of grass were soft to sit upon. The Boy Scouts camped here at Easter time, and we liked them so much that we took them Easter eggs. It is also where once the gypsies came. Lockie, Nan-Nan's wife, disapproved thoroughly. Margaret. One day I was gently swinging on a low branch of an ancient apple tree, holding the branch close to my face, when our cow came ambling along. She must have thought I was eating an apple, because the next minute her horn was in my mouth, and I was tossed. She was not an angry cow, but I was a bloody mess. My front teeth had gone, but luckily only one was a second tooth. The others were still my baby ones. A very kind dentist saw me. Dr. Griffiths was his name, and he had a goldfish tank in his waiting room. For months, or even a year, I had a gap where my teeth should have been. I must have been one of the very few people who has ever actually been tossed by a cow. Then there was the wood. It deserves a capital letter. Both Mummy and Daddy took us for walks until we were big enough to go off and explore on our own. It was nicer in fine weather, but if it rained you just covered up and put on gumboots. The best place to start was our wood, which had paths and jungly bits, and was nearly big enough to get lost in. From the house you looked across to great beech trees and a copper beech, and you might even see a flash of white in the branches. That was an albino squirrel. Mauve flowering rhododendrons abounded. Henry. During a school holiday, Mummy's great friend and Priscilla's godmother, Marie Scott, came to stay, with her daughter Pat and 2 sons. Mike and Chris were about my age, but tougher and wilder. Very soon we formed the Tree Climbing and Falling Club, which involved climbing as high up a rhododendron as you could go, and then flinging yourself into space. As it was strictly a boys-only club, Elizabeth and Pat set up a rival society, the White Snake, which was so secret that no one knew what it did. It probably happened at the time when Mummy had bought Elizabeth her first bra to go with her school uniform, and E was so proud of it that she wanted to wear it outside her tunic. We boys had a lot of fun until Daddy decreed that the TC and F Club must close, officially because we were breaking the rhododendrons, but perhaps he also feared for our bones. From the first step into it, on the wide path, soft with leaf mould and beech mast, it was magical. We got to know most of the paths and corners of the wood. A stream had cut a sandy gully in one place, leaving the roots of the trees exposed and undercutting the edge, forming little caves in the golden soft sandy sides. It was a favourite place to play. John. It was a wonderful wood. You go down the garden and through what must have been a gate, across the stream by the tiny bridge, and then through the orchard up the other side, and then into the wood. Once there, shortly you would come to one of these beech trees. I know I used to spend a lot of time playing in the wood, and especially under a beech tree. Every time I go into a beech wood, just seeing the sort of sandy soil that you sometimes get under beech trees, which is most likely why they grow so well under those conditions, makes me think, well, here I am, back again. Here's this little 5 or 6-year-old doing I'm not quite sure what, with a car, with a model car, probably not even that, perhaps just pure imagination and sand and nothing much else. Doing very little, except sitting and looking up at the leaves. We knew where the best primroses were, the wood anemones, and later the wonderful bluebells. And once, as Margaret was treading through the bluebells, an adder snaked away from her foot, frightening her into a headlong dash for home. Ruth remembers the gate to the wood, where she was terrified to go alone because her older siblings had told her there were lions and tigers there. She also needed tremendous courage to jump across the guggle, a little runnel of water perhaps 1 foot across, channeled from one of the streams. It could run fast and loud, but it was not a favourite place. The trees of the wood were tall and rather close together. Beeches, chestnuts, ash, rowan, holly. Not everyone really knew their names. Visitors used to come for walks in the wood and exclaim about its beauty, but we thought that they were silly because all they ever did was walk down the main path from one side to the other and then back again. They never explored, and yet it was such an obvious place to explore, though perhaps in company. Frankly, Margaret was never happy going into the wood all alone because it was so quiet. Go along that soft path for a little way, and then perhaps there would be a bear behind you, waiting to pounce, or perhaps a face would appear from that rhododendron bush over there. Then there was the neighbourhood beyond. Follow the main path through the wood, and it came out on the other side at the road opposite Hammerwood house grounds. You might have thought that this place had great seniority and that the area had been called after the house, but it was a latecomer, and maybe a bit of a fraud to have taken on the name. Built late in the 18th century, a great square block of a building, said to have 100 rooms. We never knew the people who lived there. In fact, it seemed to be deserted until World War II, when it was commandeered for billeting army troops. Here, some low branches of an ancient beech tree form 2 natural swings, a wonderful place to play. This was the way we led Peter the pony to be shod by the blacksmith, because we would walk through the forest on a little road all the way to Ashurst Wood, a tiny hamlet of 5 or 6 houses about 2 miles away. Here, at our nearest shop, we could agonize about whether to spend our pocket money on peppermints or sherbet. We each got 2 pennies a week, of which 1 went into the church collection. We explored far and wide over green fields and on paths through woodland. At the far side of the field beyond our paddock, people were living in a converted railway carriage, complete with smoke coming out of a metal chimney. We never knew who they were, and it was a mystery how the carriage had got there. Going in other directions, we would pick primroses or come home with a basket of blackberries. A gate leading out of the side of our wood crossed the Hammerwood house drive and brought one immediately to the village cricket green at the top of the hill. Scabious grew all over that field. People would sit next to the tiny pavilion on deck chairs, and the scorer made careful marks on his sheet. One could see the village cricket games being played from the Bower House garden, little white figures on the top of the hill far over there. The village green was also used for celebrations for the Jubilee of King George V and Queen Mary in 1935, when we all got mugs with their pictures printed on them and medallions. Margaret. We played cricket there too, though I was usually made to field way out near the boundary on the assumption that no one would ever hit a ball as far as that. I only batted once, but made 2 proud runs. The drive, as it was called, from the Tunbridge Wells Road to the Bower House, seemed quite a long way for someone with small legs. First it passed the vicarage, a large old block of a house where the Trelaws lived, then past the field and through a dark tunnel of trees, down the hill, its banks tangled with bramble and ivy and bryony. Margaret. It could be quite dark in that tunnel, and I didn't like it a bit. Village boys waylaid me there one afternoon. They got me in the undergrowth and got my knickers off while I fought with fury. They got nowhere with me, but I was trembling mad, arrived home upset, and Mummy was just as angry. Whether she put in a word or not, I do not know. I was not troubled again, but feared that bit of road every day. It's a common enough tale, and it leaves no scars, except that even now, in old age, as I go down that road, I remember. Then at last the smell of Verity's cow stables signalled the sight of home. Mr. and Mrs. Verity ran the dairy farm opposite the Bower House. They lived in a farmhouse which was very dark inside and had low ceilings. We enjoyed the milking shed and the milk cooler in its special room. Everything always looked clean in those sheds, swilled down with water. A new milking machine was brought in just before the war, but, even so, most of the milking was done by hand. We would be sent across to Verity's with jugs to collect the milk, and that meant, of course, carrying full jugs home again without spilling. Not so easy. Just below Verity's farm was the pond. This was a stinky black pool surrounded by overgrown bulrushes, and we never found a use for those wonderful brown spears which turned into cotton wool. An ancient black and rather slimy log which had fallen into the pond invited exploration and various imaginative games, but it was actually difficult not to slip off and into the deep black mud below. Even with dreams about Arthur Ransom books and boats, we knew that this was a really foul bit of water. Lockie used to hate that pond, and it was with delight that she reported to the family, after we had left, how a bomb had fallen in it sometime in 1941, and how its black mud had exploded all over the Bower House. Hammerwood Church is on the Tunbridge Wells Road, 100 yards beyond the bus stop. This is where we were all christened by whichever of our family clergy happened to be around. This is where Myrtle, Lockie and Nan-Nan's daughter, was married. Services were held every 2 weeks, alternating with services at Holtai, and where we used to go for 11 a.m. matins. Then Nan-Nan had to pump the bellows to get the organ going. We tried to help pumping, but it needed more muscle than we had, and when there was not enough air, the organ flattened down in a sickly swoon. Behind the great brass eagle lectern, Daddy would read the lesson. Our big prayer books had some printing in red letters, especially in the Te Deum, and we knew every word by heart. The floor was bare grey boards, and sunshine sometimes came in through the windows with motes dancing on the beams. Ruth was allowed to stack the kneelers in castles up and down the aisle because she was so little. We were not allowed to wriggle. There were never many people in the congregation. Holtai was better. In fact, the whole thing was boring, boring, boring. Every second week we would go to Holtai to church, and usually that meant walking 1 mile there and 1 mile back again. Presumably it was thought to be good for us, or perhaps that we would use up our energy and sit still after walking such a long way. Girls had to wear hats to church. In the winter-time a beret would do, but for Easter Margaret had to have a new straw hat with little flowers all round it and a pretty dress, and we had to wear our smart clothes to walk to church. We could rehearse every step of that route, up the hill past the wood and Hammerwood house, turn left, skirting the fields, through Russet Wood, past the bank of a hazel hedge, through the last bit to Mrs. Pengelly's house. She sometimes invited us in for tea and ginger biscuits, and then on to Tunbridge Wells Road and to the church. There was a short cut, but the red horse kept in that field could turn nasty and chase us. On one side of the field the stile was broken, and on the other side the latch of the gate was very stiff, so we were petrified of being trapped there with a snorting, heavily breathing red horse on our heels. Short cuts were best avoided, unless we were so late for dinner that the punishment would be worse than the horse. The best thing about Holtai, quite apart from its small, cosy atmosphere, was that we were usually let out before the sermon to play on the common, a place with tall bracken and gorse thickets which made it a heavenly playground. John remembers playing in the tunnels in the gorse. Harvest festival there, the church decorated with sheaves of wheat, was a great service, Enormous marrows from the Bower House garden might have had our names written on them. Write it on in small letters on the baby marrow, and see it a few weeks later vastly magnified. On 11 November we all gathered at the Little War Memorial, wearing our red poppies and singing "O God, our help" in grey, damp weather. Our main local school at primary level was St. Catherine's in East Grinstead, run by Miss Parkhouse. Elizabeth and Henry went there, and later on it was Margaret and then John. We used to run up the drive in time to catch the bus from Tunbridge Wells to East Grinstead, and sometimes it was a close thing to be in time. We knew every bend in that road, every tree along those 4 miles. Then from the centre of East Grinstead we walked to St. Catherine's. John began on his 5th birthday and found it a very long way. Along to the railway line, and then along a walkway, over the bridge, and finally to the school. It was 1.5 miles at least. Margaret. I do not remember being particularly happy at school. In fact, I remember having dreary imaginings of how I would die, and all the teachers would tramp over me as I lay collapsed on the ground, and then they'd be sorry and serve them right. Extraordinary. We wrote in pencil on cheap rough paper, and when there was no more paper we had to rub out the pages and use them again. No margin or half page was allowed to be wasted. We learned reams of poetry, all forgotten now. We were forever reading about Hammerwood the Wake, but never seemed to progress to modern times. I was very supple as a child, and could easily lie on the floor on my tummy with my toes touching my head, indeed my forehead, in a frightening backbend. Once I was setting a record for maintaining this position for the whole 20 minutes of break, when a teacher came in and became hysterical, which I honestly couldn't understand, because for me it was nothing. At that time, a teacher would often say, "Hold out your hand," and then smack it with a ruler, which could be quite sore. Once the teacher was wrong in judging me at fault, so when she smacked me, I smacked her back on the face. Miss Parkhouse did not know how to deal with this. I was kept in the cloakroom for the rest of the day, and I really don't know the eventual outcome. John. I do remember a very kind Miss Parkhouse who taught there, and I also met her after the war with Margaret when we went to look her up. By then she was a rather sad old woman, and of course she didn't have the school any more. But she was still in the house, which was called St. Catherine's. I enjoyed being at that little school for 20 children, that's all we were, and playing in the shrubbery in the rhododendrons at break time. The school was simply a double-storey house with a biggish garden, very overgrown. Then Elizabeth went as a boarder to the big convent school, St. Agnes and St. Michael, in East Grinstead, dubbed Ag and Mick by Daddy. Henry started his schooling at St. Catherine's at the age of 4, and then went to the Green Hut nearby, a fine school with a total enrolment of 6 or 7 boys, to be taught a full range of subjects, including Latin. The proprietor and sole schoolmaster was Leslie Tyler, a hero to his pupils, a viola player, and Daddy's frequent companion on the golf course. In 1936, at 8 years old, Henry went on to St. George's Choir School at Windsor Castle. He wasn't chosen for the choir. We never knew why, because he was intensely musical and had such a lovely treble voice. This was the greatest disappointment, perhaps, of his whole life, and certainly none of the family could understand it. Bravely he survived, and we were proud of him. Henry. Going to St. George's was a family idea, because so much music was happening at the Bower House. At this school of 50 boys, about half were in the choir of St. George's Chapel in the castle. If I could join the choir, it would make a difference to the family finances, because the top 12 choristers got paid £25 a term, I think, and if you were in the second 12, £12. The boys not in the choir were called supers. That sounds very grand, but was actually short for supernumerary. And the choir sounded wonderful. They sang at services every day, but we small ones sat near them at the 2 Sunday services and listened to the music. Those who wanted to become members could go to the choir practices, held in a special choir room not far from the chapel. I attended those, and as I attended I felt, well, this is where I'd like to be. And possibly the people I admired most were in the choir already. When you're 8 years old, big boys of 12 and 13 are almost gods, so I was hoping to get in. To join the choir, you had to be accepted before you turned 10. When I was 9, a family friend, Fatty Hunt, gave me singing lessons at the Bower House during the summer holidays, and then I went for an audition at the house of the organist, William Harris, in the castle. My failure to get into the choir was possibly the greatest disappointment of my whole life, though it was mitigated by constant musical activity at the school. I think there was only one vacancy to be filled at my audition, and the boy who got in was one Gordon. By a happy and extraordinary coincidence, that same Jimmy Gordon is now, 70 years later, my choir master at St. Martin's-in-the-Veldt Church in Johannesburg. This brings us to music. There was a lot of it at the Bower House. It began with pianos. There was a baby grand in the drawing room, and other upright pianos around, certainly a honky-tonk up in the billiard room beyond the kitchen, and another up in the playroom at the top of the house. We don't know where they came from, whether from other members of the family who didn't have room and said, well, the Blagdens, they have this huge house, they could fit it in somewhere. Elizabeth and Henry began playing at the age of 6, or even before, piano of course, and Elizabeth played the cello, whereas Henry had a small violin. Hammerwood School, off the cul-de-sac opposite Lockie's house, was not one we attended, presumably because it was not thought to be good enough, but we did use it for music lessons arranged by the East Sussex Rural Music School. The development of this school was largely inspired by our Granny Parry, Mummy, and the teachers Miss Edwina Palmer and Miss Agnes Best. Once a week these 2 teachers would arrive in their little maroon car, complete with instruments, and we would all meet in the schoolroom for class violin lessons. In fact, these lessons had begun in our own playroom at the top of the Bower House. It was big enough for regular violin classes of the village children, perhaps 10 or 12 of them, and we learnt a lot of music there. Beginning with open strings and Carmen's whistle, we soon progressed to more complicated things. Henry. Every week or fortnight, whatever it was, 2 women, Miss Palmer and Miss Best, came along. Miss Palmer was rather mannish, with square-cut shoulders, whereas Miss Best was very soft. As part of the East Sussex Rural Music School, they toured around giving classes to children at 6pence a lesson. I vaguely remember taking some sort of part in it, but it wasn't our scene. I was mostly at St. George's at the time. I was very fond of Miss Palmer and Miss Best, who, incidentally, wrote books on music for children, published by Oxford University Press. They must have been pretty good books, because they were still selling when I joined OUP years and years later. It was from the East Sussex Rural Music School that the Lewes Festival began. Every now and then there would be a great get-together in Lewes County Hall, organised by the Rural Music School for rather primitive small-child concerts. You joined together with children from other places, and it was a big event. Oh, it was exciting to play things like a march by Adam Cass. Henry played there more than once, and so did Margaret on her violin before a new young conductor called Malcolm Sargent, who went on to become a household word. This was also the time when Glyndebourne began, and we went to a concert there too, not an opera. Elizabeth continued the cello at school, and Henry had violin lessons at St. George's. Margaret and John learned in the group lessons at home, and later, when the group lessons were no longer possible, they were taken on by Miss Wheeler, who lived in Forest Row. If Elizabeth had lived, the family would have had a string quartet, with Margaret as leader, John second violin, Henry on viola, and Elizabeth playing cello. Henry was getting more music than any of us at St. George's. Henry. Naturally, we had to sing in the school. More like community singing, class singing, which was nice, though not the same as singing in the chapel. And there were musical plays that were put on, which we took part in. And we played musical instruments. For me, the violin. I was never very good at it, really, but even then I remember playing, Vivaldi A minor, Handel E major sonata, and various works for viola, probably Corelli, and learning the piano as well. So in fact I was doing 3 different instruments at once, which meant quite a lot of practice time, because of course singing was just extra. I heard, and internally I was singing, a lot of marvellous music, things like psalm chants and settings of hymns and anthems, some of which have cropped up again in later life because since then I've been in one choir or another almost continuously. On Sunday afternoons, after 4 o'clock tea in the dining room, we gathered round the piano in the drawing room, Mummy at the keyboard, and sang hymns. She'd start us off with something, and we all piped up, Daddy with a much lower voice, an extremely good bass, right down, beyond the bottom note of a cello. This was a lovely part of our life. It introduced us to the good hymns early, much better probably than in church. We'd go on for half an hour or so, usually rationed to 2 choices each. We knew all our favourites by their A&M numbers, of course, hymns ancient and modern, 210, 217, 224, 335. It was like an auction between us. We were given special verses to sing solo, and at Christmas time the carols were very popular. Henry. I can remember Aunt Tag, Daddy's sister, sitting down at the baby grand in the drawing room and playing a Mendelssohn song without words. I'd been having a go at the same one at school and thinking, this is lovely. And my view was, she plays the piano quite terribly. It wasn't just that she was not nearly as good as Mummy, but she played her chords in the most sentimental way imaginable, and I couldn't take it. Of course we played on that piano ourselves, or, if we played the violin, say, then Mummy accompanied on it. Also in the drawing room, in the early 1930s, there was a radio, a wireless, that stood up in a little alcove on the left of the fireplace out of the way, because it wasn't very much used. The programme I remember was called In Town Tonight. The introductory theme was Knightsbridge by Eric Coates from his London suite. It reminds me of that time. It was one of my best tunes ever. Occasionally there would be a concert arranged by Mummy in a Women's Institute hall at the top of the drive beyond the vicarage. Then the Bower House would be full of musicians. Mummy refused to allow the woman who played the flute to practice in the house. "She's out of tune," she said. "People who play wind instruments never tune them properly." So the flautist had to go to one of the greenhouses to practice. For one of these village concerts, someone, probably Mummy, made tickets, and some of us walked Hammerwood's entire region flat, going to all sorts of cottages and places that we didn't know existed, selling tickets. It was wonderful going around, and they did come. The hall was quite full. At last we get to the house itself. It had a ground floor, first floor, and top floor up at the gable end. There were 2 rooms there, bitterly cold in winter. One was Daddy's little dressing room, where he slept frequently. That was the smaller room at the front of the house, a rather dark little place. Then there was the larger room, the playroom, with a lovely window looking out down the garden. At one stage Henry slept there, and Elizabeth probably did too. It was quite big, it seemed to us when we were small. A good room to play in. There was a cupboard at the far end with Meccano and lots of other toys, and we often played on the floor. As well as the piano and the swing, there was even a ping-pong table. Henry. The window of the playroom. I always imagined that when Robin Hood was on his deathbed and with his last strength, and remember the bleeding, he strung his bow and fired his last shot through the window, and was buried where his arrow fell. He might have aimed through just such a window. You reached this top floor on a staircase of solid oak blocks. Halfway up was a low door leading to the attic. In this magical space it was dangerous to tread in between the rafters, because that was mere plasterboard, and you could drop through the ceiling below. Strange old boxes were there, an old trunk or two. Now, to return to the ground floor. We had already met the front hall, framed with thick oak pillars and beams, with a separate corner where the grandfather clock stood, and our swing hanging from the centre beam. It also held the telephone, a black instrument, East Grinstead 413. Here in the hall was where games of murder began. We gathered to take our mysterious cards, the dark night filling funny little hiding places all over the house. When the lights went out and the scream was heard, the effect was pretty blood-curdling. The hall was also where the picture of the vine was hung, a photograph of the great embroidered altar frontal worked by Grandmother Blagden. Astonishingly, there is no basic material in this huge creation, 9 foot 6 inches long by 2 foot 8 inches high. It is made entirely of bound threads and single stitches, using among other things real gold thread and our grandmother's own hair. She created it at a time of immense grief after her daughter Ada had died young, for the mission church, St. Frieswide's. It is now in the church at High Wycombe. When Priscilla and her Hall family went there in 1986, it was set up specially for them to see. Usually it comes out only at Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, otherwise staying carefully rolled up in its long wooden box. From the kitchen and out of the hall went a longish passage of uneven small tiles all the way to the dining room in the old wing, so that dinner would be well cooled by the time of its arrival, and along this passage there were photographs of ancient relatives. Margaret. If I was overcome by tears or temper, I would be instructed to go and tell Sephi, though I had no idea who Sephi was, except that it was a picture of someone on the wall. The passage was a good place to skip, and 100 skips before breakfast was my usual effortless ration. At the end of the passage, just before the dining room, was the butler's pantry. Why it should have been called this we cannot imagine, because we never had a butler. It was the washing-up room. It was there that the great wooden racks were filled with dripping plates, where the huge porcelain sink was too high for small people to reach properly. We were only allowed to dry. A door in the butler's pantry opened up onto a staircase, which led down to the cellar. Here there was pretty well nothing at all, except perhaps a few tired sacks of ancient coal. It was a dreary place, with not even a grating for light, so we did not like to explore it. Margaret. Once, when I was very little, a fancy-dress birthday party had been arranged. Elizabeth, with her lovely long fair hair, was to be Alice. John may have been the Mad Hatter, and Henry was the White Rabbit. The laundry basket had been transformed into a teapot, or so they said. It still looked like a laundry basket to me. They put me in it, wearing some costume with ears, and they hid me behind the cellar door while the party began. When the proper moment arrived, the teapot, with me in it, was produced as a great surprise. Regrettably, by then, the Dormouse was in tears. She just cried and cried from the sheer ignominy of it all, as well as having had to endure the laundry basket and the cellar. I never liked the cellar after that. Back on the ground floor passage, we reached the dining room. It had a pillar in the middle, perhaps the remains of an old dividing wall. Bookcases filled the walls of the far half of this room. This was where one could read the Children's Encyclopedia, compiled by Arthur Mee, and learn about rubber plantations and Stephenson's engine and pygmies and other fascinating things. It also contained all the books we ought to read, like Kipling and Walter Scott, difficult stuff in rather small print and largely to be avoided. On the shelves of the big dresser we arrayed our Christmas boxes of chocolates, After all, what better to give a tribe of children if you can't buy individual presents? In a good year, the last caskets would still be there when the empty spaces were refilled with Easter egg loot. This was where Uncle Theo brought his new cine projector and showed us those first film cartoons of Felix the Cat and Popeye. Here, too, would be set up a special table for visiting young friends and relations. The children did not sit with the grown-ups at such parties. The main dining room, which we used as a family every day, was the first half of the room and was big enough to accommodate the biggest nearly round oak table imaginable. We always thought that King Arthur must have had something rather like it. It could seat 16 people comfortably and seemed very high. Any small person had a special long-legged chair, otherwise their chin just reached the table. This was where we had our breakfasts, dinners, and high teas. The large walk-in fireplace in the dining room, with its huge iron hood and fireback, was never used for its true purpose. Instead, there was a small black Queen Anne-type stove, not very hot and rather slow for making the toast on long wire forks. There was also the bread oven in the dining room, but it was never used as intended either. It was just a hiding place, especially when playing sardines. There were strict rules at tea in the afternoon, at the dining room table. You began with bread and butter by itself, and then you moved on and had bread and butter and jam or honey, and if there was cake then you'd have that. It was a real sit-down meal, and for us children it was the last meal of the day at maybe past 4 o'clock, though you might have a glass of milk or something before going to bed. Henry. When we got bigger, sometimes we had a supper in the drawing room. It would be soup, which I never enjoyed much. I hated soup when I was little. If we were lucky, we might have a glass of potato wine, made by Lockie or someone else of the village. The main room leading off the hall was the drawing room. It was a beautiful room. We always loved it, and it was the centre of our downstairs life. There were deep, chintz-covered sofas and chairs, the baby grand that Mummy loved, the white wood-panelled walls, the 2 alcoves, and, best of all, the window seat, which was large enough for several people and looked straight out through a great sash window onto the best view and the best garden in the world. It faced the sun. In those days people had winter curtains and summer curtains. In winter, the heavy dark velvet curtains made the window seat a cosy secret place to hide. When summer came, the heavy curtains got packed away, and light flowered ones went up, which changed the whole aspect of the room. That room saw many parties. We used to sit on that floor in a ring and pass the slipper or pass the parcel. We played musical bumps or grandmother's steps. We played innumerable charades. The big curtains hid us for plays and hide and seek. Margaret. This is where Granny taught me to curtsy, practising for the magic moment when I would A. be presented at court, B. meet Princess Alexandra, C. perform at any other royal occasion. Some years earlier I had disgraced myself here. The white panelling of the room was a blank open page, just waiting for a new look. One day, when no one happened to be noticing, I got my crayons and had a happy hour colouring in one of the panels. It was very hard work, but effective in purple. The next panel was begun in vivid green, an interesting contrast, but sadly I was discovered. The improvements I made were not appreciated, and I felt that the punishment that followed was most unjust because I had merely wanted to improve things and not be naughty. In one of the alcoves was a tin with sweets in it. These were severely rationed to 1 a day, perhaps 2 on a Saturday. They were boiled sweets of various colours. Purple was a favourite. White was not, because it tasted funny. It was dangerous to steal too many, because it would be noticed, but I could usually manage 1 or 2, very occasionally. Here we sat on wet Sunday afternoons, carefully writing our thank-you letters, as we also did in the dining room, or stitching squares of delicate cloth into lavender bags. The stitches were always uneven and too big.
or learning to knit or to patch, or painstakingly painting intricate patterns with watercolours, or sitting at Aunt Tag's knee while she read to us. And we played cards, endless games of Beggar My Neighbour, and later sevens and then hearts. We loved games. Although we look back at an England painted in sunshine, this is not true because most of the time it rained and we had to be indoors, occupied, interested, and probably impossible. Many visitors came to the Bower House, and for them the drawing-room was where they were received. A lot of them came about music. There were working visitors too. For instance, it used to be said that the doctor and the piano tuner always arrived in time for dinner. The meals were good. It was also understandable because in those days 4 miles out of town was quite a long way, so a meal added in was a sensible idea. Unlike the dining-room fireplace, the other large one in the drawing-room, with its great hood and fire-back, was used regularly. We roasted chestnuts, or made a great fiery furnace of old holly on 12th night when the decorations came down. It was there that one could look into the heart of the coals and imagine fairyland, or demons, or what hell might be like. It was the drawing-room fire that warmed us best in winter. Henry. I remember the drawing-room as a great place for making and putting up Christmas decorations, which were all over the house, but especially in that room. When Christmas was over, and it came to 12th night, then there had to be a great burning of the holly that had been on the pictures, of our paper chains that had been strung around various rooms, and the mistletoe. It all had to go, and so in this great old fireplace there would be a wonderful blaze at the end of Christmas. In those days, and in such houses, there were fireplaces in most rooms, but without maids it was an impossible task to set and clean them. Granny had fires in the rooms in their house, Hook Hall, but she had servants. A fire in our nursery was rare, very small, and usually because someone was sick. The trick was to start the fire with lavender stalks because they smelled so good, and that is Margaret's main memory of earache, a smell of burning lavender. Otherwise we relied on those tower paraffin stoves, whose light made beautiful rosettes of light on the ceiling. The staircase leading upstairs, with its spiral of steps turning round the great old sailing ship mast, took you to the landing. This had a deceptive step to it, not to be tripped on when balancing a tray of early morning tea, and this is where the laundry was sorted each week. It can hardly be believed now that we as children were allowed to change our clothes only once a week, even our pants. A vest, a shirt, a bodice, knickers, socks, a single change once a week, and that was it, just like sheets. Margaret. By the end of the week, the state of my knickers was usually terrible, indeed smelly, and I would fold my clothes at night far away at the end of the bed. Did anyone notice this at home? We never knew. It was understandable because, with so many of us in the family, the strain on the laundry bill would have been acute, even though there was a drying rack in the kitchen. For many years our things were all laundered at home, but at some stage they went to a laundry, where everything was marked with the laundry number 144 and counted and bagged. The always warm linen cupboard opened its wide doors onto the landing. The first spare room was quite large and led off the landing. It had ample space for 2 beds. Margaret remembers this as her punishment room, all too frequently endured for spells of solitary penitence. The second spare room led off the first one through a little landing. Go up the steps and there was the tiny lav behind the creeper-coloured window, or go through the door and there was the bedroom. A big double brass bed with a white counterpane was the main feature of this room, and there was another little staircase from here leading down to the dining room. Mummy's bedroom was the first off a little corridor of rooms, also from the landing. It was a small room, almost filled by the double bed. There was just enough room for the baby's bath and side table, for that is where first Ruth and then Priscilla were cared for. They had those curved glass baby's bottles with a teat at either end, one to suck from and the other to let the air in. The bath was a cross-legged frame to hold a tough rubber sheet. Margaret was too young to bathe Ruth, although she could give her bottle, but quite old enough to help with Priscilla. Next door was Miss Cunningham's room, called after the two Miss Cunninghams who came to help look after us. That room, which was also occupied in its time by other nannies and by ourselves, was small and had 2 beds. Margaret. John and I shared Miss Cunningham's room for a while. It was over Christmas, and on Christmas Eve we had gone to bed in a state of high excitement, hoping that Father Christmas had not been briefed about our misdemeanours during the past year, because if he had, we would not qualify for those highly anticipated stockings. It was midwinter dark. The dark in the country, where we were, was absolute. I woke to a light swinging in through the door and peeped through my half-closed eyes. It was Father Christmas himself, with his sack. Quickly, I closed my eyes. His lantern light swung over me, glowing red through my eyelids, and then moved across the narrow room. I peeped out to see his back, a little stooped as he filled John's stocking from the sack which he carried. I closed my eyes again, and he came to my bed. The lantern light swung again, and then there were the sounds of crackling paper, then silence, and I peeped again to see the door gently closing. Of course I believed it. For me this was totally true. And when next morning we opened our stockings, there were the wonderful things. Nothing, absolutely nothing, can beat the smell of a tangerine wrapped in silver paper in the toe of a Christmas stocking. It doesn't matter how many pockets of nachos I see nowadays in the fruit and veg. That single tangerine means magic to me, the epitome of Christmas. The next room was the nursery, a good-sized room with a lovely big window looking south over the garden. A fireplace was occasionally in use. There was a built-in toy cupboard, bookshelves full of books, a small table, 3 beds. We had all the fairy books, the green, the yellow, the blue, the silver, and so on. Margaret. We also had plenty of books about King Arthur and his knights, of whom my favourite was always Sir Geraint. Mummy did not approve of the fairy stories, and I was forbidden to read them at one stage. When the spring came, and the great thick curtains that kept in the warmth in winter were changed, the bright-coloured materials were so light and thin that it was difficult to go to sleep at 7 p.m. in the long day. The walls were painted with sky-blue distemper, but the part around my bed looked like a complicated geographical map where I had picked off all the paint around my bed. This room, like all the rooms where we children slept, was shared. The return home of Elizabeth and Henry for the holidays meant that gentle John was moved out to the next room, leaving me alone to take the brunt of their teasing, show off, swank, blub blub, until inevitably I ended up in tears. It was a kind of torture from which I would hide away to cry soggily underneath my dear eiderdown, which became my own private little place, and there were little holes to let in the light and air. The plumbing seemed to function in the 2 lavs inside the house, and the other 2 outside the garden lobby, but hot water was less certain, because for many years this depended on the furnace, and whether we had bought coal, and whether Nan had stoked it. A staircase led down to the furnace room. We have vivid memories of Nan working down there, sweating hard like an ancient god, archetypal in power, fueling the whole household. At one stage we had our own generator for electricity, but this made a great deal of noise and was only intermittently successful. The 2 bathrooms of the house, under the eaves on the first floor, were nothing like the bathrooms of today. There were no tiled floors or walls, no shower heads. The floors were wooden and sloped dramatically down towards the outside wall. Daddy's cutthroat razor, leather strop and shaving mirror lived on the bathroom shelf, except for one day when, for no apparent reason, Margaret simply threw the mirror out of the window so that it broke. Very nasty. And one day Henry thought he would strop Daddy's razor,
just as he had seen it done, and the next moment he had sliced clean through the leather and was left with the incriminating end of the strop in his hand. Luckily no blood, but certainly caught red-handed. As he recalls, his own shock and guilt were punishment enough. The small bathroom was for guests, and that is where Aunt Tag had her cold bath every morning. We would wait outside the door to hear her squeal as she got in, but she never made a sound because she was so brave. Years later, Lockie told us, through the pursed mouth she usually put on when talking about Tag, that Mrs. Hobart Hampden never ever had a cold bath. She always put in some hot water. So, there went another myth, evaporated in steam. The natural functions, however, required more accommodation than this. There were 4 children. Ruth and Priscilla were too small to count and had nappies and potties anyway, and many adults. Miss Rackham, one of the dictators who masqueraded as a nurse, insisted that we all did our business before a certain time, and if we could not, we were made to sit on our appointed throne until some kind of result had been achieved. Older ones like Henry could escape this torture, because they could go to the lavs outside, lucky them. Margaret and John were the sufferers. But at night, with many visitors and children, and perhaps with all the lights going off at 10 p.m., the chamber pot became an essential item. There they were, one under each bed, and every morning it was someone's duty to empty them. Beautiful pots they were too, usually with roses on them. It's amazing to realize how things have changed. We really did have wash basins with huge enamel jugs of water in the spare rooms. We really did have a row of shiny brass jugs with dear little hinged lids for hot water, and they had to be carried up to the visitors for their morning wash. Unbelievable now to think, too, that we really did have bed warmers, long-handled, flat brass containers with holes in the lids, which we filled with hot coals and then pushed down those cold, cold sheets to warm up the beds for our guests. Even the hot water bottles were made of metal. Rubber ones were rare, and plastic hadn't been invented. The Bower House had its own well in the backyard. It had sweet water and hardly ever ran dry, though in later years it was closed. This backyard was bricked, stepping up from the lobby below where everyone cleaned up after walks or work in the garden. The lobby itself was quite big, because this was where we washed muddy paws with Lifebuoy soap in the basin, sometimes with extra tenderness because of the chilblains. This was where we left our gumboots, our macks, our trikes, our hats, umbrellas, gloves, and all those outside things. It was an excellent room. The kitchen was so old-fashioned that we wonder how meals were prepared there. There was a deal kitchen table in the middle. Ruth remembers being stood on it to be dried after a bath with John. Then there was the paraffin oven and stove, the old wooden sink and its plate racks. The tile floor was unevenly worn. That is where Monica Dickens taught Margaret the Lambeth walk up and down the kitchen. There must have been quite a bit of space. Oi! The kitchen led to the larder and the cold larder. There was a Coke cooler there as well, because in those days there was no fridge. Cold meats and cheeses and milk were kept in the cold larder. Then there was the laundry where Lockie and Miss Jode, or whoever else had been called in, pummelled tough sheets in steaming tubs of frothy water. They regularly used Reckitt's Blue and starch. These working spaces led into the back courtyard too. Mysteriously fitted behind the kitchen and billiard room was a cosy bedsitter for resident help who came and went and were not in the same class as governess. Fraulein from the Black Forest lived there for a year in 1937. The Jewess from Vienna wept there in 1938 before returning to Austria. Monica Dickens lived there for a few months. And then came Eleanor, the one who could only make puddings with sugared violets. The working side of the house led to outbuildings. Beyond the deep furnace room was the apple shed, a wonderful place of dim light. Its layers of wide shelves were grey with quiet dust. The sweet cidery smell of bramleys and coxes and russets was thick in the stillness. These apples were laid out, not touching each other lest any rot should spread. One could explore those shelves and find a sweet, soft, wrinkled old russet there, rich with flavour, unforgettable. On the other side of the apple shed, but facing into the garden, were 2 potting sheds. One of these was used to make punnets for the soft fruit, and the floor was often covered with clean, curly wood shavings from the punnets that were made there. The carpenter's shop in Nazareth must have been like that. The real potting shed was next door, a working place of soil and dampness, and there was another potting shed up near the greenhouses too, more like the one Peter Rabbit found in Mr. McGregor's garden. The greenhouses were big, and there were at least 3 of them. Tomatoes never smelled better or tasted better than the ones we grew there. Daddy had many plants going in there. The garage was at the end of the potting shed building. It might have been a stable in years past. It didn't seem to be custom built, and we definitely called it a garage in true Sussex speak. At one stage it housed the lorry for the trips to London to deliver flowers and fruit. Our cars, one after the other, lived there too. At the end of this building was Locke's cottage, which we so loved to visit. In the mid-1930s, Daddy put up a second cottage for the extra help he needed, Mr. and Mrs. Puttick and their family. This was a little wooden house, which always looked new and small, but was apparently adequate. Today there's a proper house there. The Putticks left at the beginning of the war. He was probably called up. We never really got to know the family. Those were the main buildings of the Bower House, but the best part of all was the gardens, the paddock, the orchard, and the wood. The other great household for us was Hook Hall in Uckfield, where our Parry grandparents lived. We went there quite often, and traditionally on Boxing Day, climbing into the car for the 15-mile drive and sure of a great welcome from Granny and Grandpa. Hook Hall was rather grand, as befitted the residence of a retired deputy chairman of the London Customs and Excise. Go through the front door, straight from the pavement in the High Street, and you were in a warm, moist, glass-roofed conservatory with fertile-smelling plants on either side of a flight of steps leading to the front door of the house itself. Once inside, you were once again assailed by smells equally unforgettable but less easy to identify, perhaps from central heating and warm carpets with overtones of polished wood. Granny would be there kissing everybody, exclaiming how we had grown, showing us where to put our things down, and immediately taking control of everyone. Her dark hair, which she would never admit to dyeing, framed a kindly face like an older version of Mummy. She was shorter than Mummy, full of energy, and a good, not to say obsessive, organizer. We're sure Grandpa also loved us dearly and enjoyed our brief visits. Like all the Parrys, he was handsome and fairly tall, though not on the scale of his son, our Uncle Ted, who was 6'2". To us he was ancient, with his grey hair, and we were rather in awe of his stiff and formal manner. He was always dressed in a suit and tie. The needle-sharp points of his waxed moustache threatened us, belying his benevolent nature. At some stage, Granny was likely to tell us that Grandpa had gone into his study to work, and we were not to disturb him. Servants at Hook Hall included at least one man, Rawlinson, who wore a light blue uniform and whose jobs included looking after the car and acting as a chauffeur. If you went down the long passage, past the flower room with its sink and its scents of cut plants, you came to the large kitchen, a dark and primitive place, where you would be greeted by friendly woman servants. On visits when we stayed the night, we would all gather for morning prayers in the big drawing-room, and the 4 or 5 servants would attend, sitting respectfully on a line of chairs along one side, while Grandpa said prayers and read from the Bible. When we had one of Granny's sumptuous teas or dinners, servants would appear as if by magic to bring or take away. Then she let us into the secret, which was that her foot pressed a button under the carpet, and an electric current made a bell ring in the kitchen. The midwinter visit was essentially an indoor affair, though we did once make a snowman nearly as big as the tallest of us. It was in summer-time that we could play around on the big lawn and go on the great swing, hung from a high branch of a cedar tree with longer ropes than any of the 5 swings at the Bower House. In December the darkness fell too early in the afternoon, and it would be dark by the time we crammed into the car with our presents for the drive home. We seldom travelled at night. We made it exciting by kneeling on the back seat and scaring ourselves with the pretence that the headlamps of the cars behind us were huge bears coming to eat us up.